All right, now I want to sort of move on to disillusionment statements, but first want to highlight an important distinction between conflict statements that, as you will see, involve use of the word but in the middle, and disillusionment statements that involve use of the word and. Before I move on to highlighting that distinction between but and, I just wanted to throw in here with respect to disillusionment. I'm here reminded of the New Yorker cartoon, I just love this one, in which a gentleman seated in a restaurant by the name of the Disillusionment Cafe is awaiting the arrival of his order. The waiter returns to his table and announces, "Your order is not ready, and nor will it ever be." At the end of the day, as we know many times over, Model 2 is about grieving, the loss of illusions about the objects of our desire, whether past and or present, and evolving to a place of serene acceptance of their limitations, separateness, and immutability, such that we can truly and non-defensively say, "It was what it was, it is what it is." And again, this is an evolution involving a series of healing cycles, disruption, repair, illusion, disillusionment, working it through, illusion, disillusionment, working it through, and evolving from relentless pursuit of what cannot be to sober acceptance that it was what it was, it is what it is. Just a little bit of a side note here. As an empathic self-object, resonating with the patient's moment-to-moment experience. So this is a story about efference, EFF, how the therapist, the empathic therapist, can respond empathically. So the Model 2 empathic therapist might offer a grieving patient, say, any of the following. "I wonder if it breaks your heart. It sounds as if it breaks your heart. It seems as if it breaks your heart. It must break your heart." Those are fine, not a problem. But I think I've over time come to believe that it's a little more effective if we simply eliminate the extra verbiage and cut to the chase with "it and it breaks your heart." Not throwing in those extra words, which after all is sort of about I, and it sounds as if, and it seems as if. I mean, if the patient comes in and, she lost both of her parents the night before in a car accident, we say, it sounds as if it breaks your heart, or it must break your heart, or must have broken your heart that you lost your parents. I mean, how about, and it broke your heart. It breaks your heart. Just cut to the chase. You have to admittedly, and you can end it with an ellipsis, those ... dots that I often use. I mean, patients don't see the ... but in my heart, I'm thinking ... which means that I'm giving the patient space to correct it a little bit, so that if I don't quite have it right, they can shift a little bit and sort of like, okay, more of that, like that thing. Instead of pointless, I'd said pointless. The patient said, well, a little more futile. I said futile, a little more futile, so that we're then still both on the same page. Okay, so how do we help the patient grieve? These are the Model 2 disillusionment statements that I've been talking about for a while now, but now I want to sort of get more specific. These are designed to facilitate the grieving. So whereas in Model 1 it's about interpretation and classical psychoanalytic and conflict statements, and it's more cognitive. Model 2 is more affective, and it's about grieving, facilitating the grieving, again, against the backdrop of an empathic background. These statements, disillusionment statements, are designed to facilitate the grieving of a patient who, refusing to mourn. I want to say something here. I talk about my book, one of my books, Relentless Hope, the refusal to grieve. And people will say, well, why don't you say the inability to grieve? For me, I want to give patients credit for having the capacity to do things, but perhaps as being conflicted about exercising that capacity, and so therefore not not utilizing that capacity or that ability, rather than that they can't. I don't say to a patient, you can't cry. I say, perhaps at this moment, again, the temporal element, you're feeling that you would rather not cry, or you're thinking that you would rather not cry, or you're feeling that you would rather not have to cry, or that's not a place you want to go to right now, highlighting the volitional component in what the patient is doing. So not that they can't cry or that they can't grieve, but rather they're not grieving, they're not crying, they're choosing not to, they don't want to, they're refusing to, they don't want to. So relentless hope, the refusal to grieve. And ultimately, well, again, with disillusionment statements, you're going to sort of help patients who might well have been refusing to grieve. You're going to help them to indeed grieve. Okay, these statements specifically designed to facilitate the grieving of a patient who, refusing to mourn or grieve, has been clinging to illusions about the objects of her desire. Optimally stressful disillusionment statements do two things. Surprise, surprise. They both challenge by speaking to the disillusioning reality that the patient is gradually coming with her head to know, adaptive capacity, head, left brain, and then support by resonating empathically with the patient's experience with her heart of devastation. So challenge by speaking to the disillusioning reality that she really does know, and then support by resonating empathically with her experience of heartbreak, her experience of devastation. And so the format, this is the simplified format, and then I'm going to get to a tripartite version. So this is two parts. You are beginning to realize that, and it breaks your heart. Let me say it again. You are beginning to realize that your mother will never love you in the way that you would have wanted her to. And it breaks your heart. So you challenge, you're beginning to recognize. That increases their anxiety, believe me, increases their anxiety. And then you immediately go, and it breaks your heart. And hopefully you say this at a point when the patient will be ready to hear it. If the patient is not, then we revert back to a conflict statement, and that's what the next slide, I think, is going to be all about. Yes, okay. As described earlier, as we well know, Model 1 conflict statements have the following format. You know that, but, there's that word but, made anxious by that knowing, you find yourself defensively reacting. You know that your mother's never going to be all of who you would have wanted her to be, but you find yourself thinking you just can't bear the thought of that, and you are not willing to give up hope. You know that, but you find yourself defensively reacting, continuing to hope. By contrast, a Model 2 disillusionment statement would have the following format. You are beginning to realize that, and in the face of that knowing, it breaks your heart, which is more of an adaptive response, where the patient is going to be able, instead of defending by protesting, no, 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 the patient is going to be more adaptively responding by letting herself be present with the pain of her heartbreak. So again, conflict statements, a little confusing, but eventually it'll become clearer. You know that, but you find yourself. Model 2 disillusionment statements, you know that, you're beginning to realize that, recognize that, understand that, and that knowledge, it breaks your heart. In other words, Model 1, and then I'm going to give some examples, Model 1 conflict statements, in an effort to enhance awareness, highlight the patient's need to defend, and therefore use but. It's about insight, awareness, highlighting the patient's awareness about her internal conflictedness. Model 2 disillusionment statements, however, in an effort not to enhance awareness, but to facilitate grieving and ultimately the evolving to acceptance, the adaptation, support the patient's capacity to adapt, and therefore use and. Okay. Here, this is the last slide in this section, and then we're going to go on to some more examples. Okay, Model 1 conflict statement. You know that Tony will always put his daughter before you, but you continue to hope that he might eventually change. Can you feel how this is someone who does not want to have to confront the reality of Tony and his limitations, his separateness, his immutability? He will always put his daughter before you, but you, made anxious and not wanting to accept that reality, you continue to be relentlessly hopeful that he might eventually change. That's a conflict statement because it highlights what's going on inside the patient. So it's about relentless hope, which you would think, oh, that's Model 2, but it's about what's going on inside the patient. All right, the disillusionment statement to perhaps the patient, same patient, a little bit later, you are beginning to realize that Tony will always put his daughter before you, and it breaks your heart. Can you see how this is easing the person towards grieving the reality of their disillusionment? Another one, Model 1 conflict statement. You know that your father will never really understand you, but you are not about to give up hope that someday he might. You can feel how that the patient gets defensive. Made anxious gets defensive. They're not about to give up that hope. And the patient says, right, I know, I guess I know my father probably never really will, but I'm not about to give up hope. Not going to give up hope. All right, that's a conflict statement. They're neurotically conflicted, jammed up, ambivalent. All right, Model 2, disillusionment statement. You are realizing that your father, or you could say you know, but we're kind of easing them into a little bit, making it a little easier for them perhaps. You are realizing that your father will never really understand you. And the pain of that realization and the anger go so deep. All right.